I watched the executive sedan spin sideways through the intersection, and I knew before the glass stopped falling that this crash would destroy somebody. What I did not expect was that the person chosen for ruin would be the quiet man in the passenger seat. Sloan Harrington stepped out, straightened her coat, and told a single father to sign a statement saying he had been driving. She believed an ordinary employee would bow to money and position. Elliot Hayes signed. But she did not know a traffic camera had recorded everything, and she did not know the injured man in the wrecked SUV knew exactly who Elliot really was. If you love stories where arrogance finally pays its bill, subscribe now and watch this quiet man turn everything around. I have watched a great many people walk into buildings that do not love them, and Elliot Hayes walked into the Harrington Mobility Group headquarters every weekday at 7:45 with the unbothered rhythm of a man who had stopped expecting the building to love him back. He was 39. He wore plain Oxford shirts washed past counting, and he ate lunch at his desk. Nobody on the 14th floor would have guessed that he had once stood in front of juries explaining, frame by frame, how a vehicle behaves in the last second and a half before impact, or that insurance carriers had flown him across 3 time zones to settle disputes worth millions. He had walked away from all of it 3 years earlier, when his wife, Diane, died after an illness that took its time and took everything, leaving him holding the hand of a 9-year-old girl who flinched whenever a suitcase appeared in the hallway. So he traded courtroom testimony for a stable badge and a garage 9 minutes from Maya's school. 3 years later, he was still calling it temporary, in the way people do when a temporary decision has quietly become a life. Maya was 12 now, sharp-tongued and stubborn, and absolutely certain her father worried too much. And every evening at 6 he was home, which was the entire architecture of the arrangement. He did not consider it a sacrifice. He considered it arithmetic. His co-workers saw a mid-level safety specialist who filed reports on time and never volunteered for happy hour. In a corporation, that is a kind of invisibility very easily mistaken for insignificance. Sloan Harrington's mornings looked nothing like that. She was 38, chief executive of a company her great-grandfather founded in a converted horse barn, and she had grown up where doors opened before she reached them, and consequences were handled by people whose names she never had to learn. I want to be fair to her, because fairness is the only honest way to tell this. She was genuinely brilliant. She read contracts faster than her own lawyers, and she had rebuilt a stagnant regional fleet operation into a national platform. But brilliance without humility calcifies into something else. By that spring she had come to believe, without ever saying it aloud, that everyone below a certain line on the organizational chart was weather. They collided for the first time on a Tuesday morning in a glass conference room on the 16th floor, over something so unglamorous I doubt anyone else remembered it by lunch. Elliot had spent 2 weeks combing the quarterly fleet safety data and had found a pattern he did not like. Every company vehicle carried a driver attention monitoring system, standard across the fleet, mandatory by internal policy. Line drivers triggered it occasionally and were coached. But a small cluster of users, all of them directors or above, were disabling the system repeatedly, sometimes before the vehicle left the garage. He put the numbers on the screen bare, because he had learned long ago that numbers argue better when nobody decorates them. His recommendation was 3 sentences long. Any driver at any level who disabled the attention system more than 4 times in 90 days would lose vehicle privileges until they completed a coaching session, whether they parked in a warehouse lot in Ohio or in the executive garage. He suggested doing it before the insurance renewal, since carriers had begun asking pointed questions about executive telematics. 2 heads nodded. The general counsel wrote something down. Then Sloan Harrington set down her coffee and asked the question that set the whole terrible machine in motion. you're proposing that a safety technician decide which members of my executive team are permitted to drive." She said it evenly, almost pleasantly, which was worse than shouting. Elliot did not blink, because he had been cross-examined by attorneys far better at intimidation than she was. "I'm proposing we apply one rule to everyone," he said. "The data doesn't care about titles, and neither does the carrier." The room went quiet in the specific way. Rooms go quiet when a subordinate has been technically correct and socially reckless in the same breath. Sloan smiled without warmth and said the company did not pay him to teach the people who owned it how to drive. That was the first contempt. That afternoon, a bank in Charlotte raised a question about an indemnity clause in the acquisition. Sloan had spent 14 months building a $400 million purchase. The board had been circling like nervous birds. She needed to be there by 4:30. And she needed someone who could explain the fleet liability profile in plain language, because the bank's risk team had flagged it. The only person in the building who could answer those questions without a rehearsal was the man she had publicly dismissed 6 hours earlier. Her assistant reached for the phone to call the company driver. Sloan waved him off, said the driver would take too long, said she thought better behind the wheel, and picked up the key fob herself. So Elliot Hayes, who wanted nothing in the world except to be home by 6, put a binder in a canvas bag and got into the passenger seat of a car he did not want to be in. The sedan chimed as she started it. The center display asked her to confirm that the driver assistance and attention monitoring package was active for this trip, a soft prompt, the kind that takes half a second to accept. Sloan reached over without looking and dismissed it. Elliot watched her do it. He saw exactly which menu she touched, and he noted the time, 4:06 in the afternoon, because noting times was a reflex he had never managed to unlearn. He said nothing, and that dismissed prompt would eventually be worth more than every dollar in the acquisition. The drive downtown took 11 minutes, and it took forever. Sloan's phone rang before they cleared the garage ramp, and it kept ringing, and each call peeled away a little more of her composure. The bank wanted revised language on the indemnity cap. A director wanted to know whether the vote could be moved up. She answered each one while merging, while turning, while glancing down at the center screen where a message thread ran in white text against black. Elliot suggested once, mildly, that she pull into the lot on the right and finish the call, that they had 8 minutes of margin. "I was running this company," she said, without looking at him, "before you were hired into the safety department." The light went amber, then red. The sedan did not slow. I want to be precise here, because precision is the whole point of this story. She was not speeding, she was not impaired, she was not reckless in any dramatic cinematic sense. She was reading a message about an indemnity cap for roughly 2.5 seconds, and in 2.5 seconds, a car covers more than 150 feet. Elliot saw the gray SUV enter the intersection on a legal green from the left. He shouted her name, one syllable, loud enough to strip his throat. She braked. It was a good, hard, late brake, and it bled off enough speed to turn a catastrophe into a very bad afternoon. The sedan's front quarter caught the SUV behind its front wheel, and both vehicles rotated, and there was that sound, which is not a bang so much as a long tearing exhale, and then the silence afterward that is somehow louder. Airbags bloomed and collapsed. The center screen went black and rebooted with a cheerful chime that felt obscene. Elliot's shoulder had been slammed against the belt, hard enough to leave a bruise the color of a storm, and for 3 or 4 seconds he simply sat there cataloging his own body the way he had once cataloged other people's wreckage. Then he moved. He checked Sloan first, because that is who he is, asking whether she could feel her hands, whether her neck hurt, telling her to look at him and not at the phone that had slid into the footwell. She said she was fine in a voice that was mostly adrenaline. So he shoved open the passenger door and crossed the wet asphalt to the SUV, where an older man sat very still behind a deflated airbag with one hand cradling his right shoulder. Elliot crouched at the window, told him not to move yet, asked his name and what day it was. The man answered both questions clearly, then looked at Elliot's face for a long, strange moment. "Graham," he said. Graham Caldwell. He was 67, silver-haired, wearing a suit that had been expensive a decade earlier and still fit. His collarbone hurt, his wrist was scraped, and he was by any measure remarkably lucky. But he kept looking at Elliot with an expression that was not confusion. It was recognition, arriving slowly, the way a name surfaces when you have not spoken it in years. He opened his mouth to say something, and behind them, from across the intersection, Sloan Harrington called Elliot's name. He walked back, expecting her to ask about the other driver, because that is what a person asks. Instead, she was standing beside the crumpled front quarter with her coat straightened and her hair pushed back into place, and the first words out of her mouth were, "Did anyone see who was driving?" Elliot stopped walking. He looked at her for what felt like a full minute and was probably 2 seconds, and in that gap I watched a man's entire understanding of his employer rearrange itself. She asked again, more urgently, scanning the sidewalk, the storefronts, the cars stacking up behind them. Then she explained rapidly, in the clipped cadence of a person building a case in real time. The acquisition vote was in 48 hours. A crash involving the chief executive would be in every trade publication by morning. Worse, the Telematics would show she had disabled her own company's attention monitoring system before the trip, and the competitors' board would use that single fact to argue that Harrington Mobility's safety culture was theater. She said the words "thousands of jobs," and she said them with real feeling, and I believe some part of her meant it. Then she said the sentence that told Elliot exactly how she had filed him in her mind. "For you, this is an insurance claim. For me, it's thousands of families." "You're asking me to lie," Elliot said. "I'm asking you to protect the company that pays you," Sloan answered without hesitation. She laid out terms the way she laid out term sheets. The company would cover every dollar, every repair, every medical bill, every premium increase anywhere. His personnel file would be handled internally, quietly, no public record. There would be a raise effective the next cycle, and she named a number that would have covered the braces, and the roof, and the summer program all at once. He said no, not loudly, not with a speech, just no. That is when her voice changed register and the thing underneath came out. She reminded him, conversationally, that the fleet safety group was on the restructuring list for the third quarter, that 3 positions had already been flagged, that decisions like that were made on the 16th floor by people who read summaries. Then she looked directly at him. A single father certainly understands the value of a stable job. She never mentioned his daughter's name, and she never had to. That is the particular cruelty of people who have learned to threaten in the passive voice. The company's internal counsel arrived before the police did, which tells you everything about the priorities of a corporation with 2,000 vehicles. A young attorney named Reese Whitlock stepped out of a black car with a tablet and a practiced expression of concern, and within 90 seconds he had established that this was a company vehicle on company business, which meant the matter fell under internal reporting protocol first. Sloan never asked Elliot to lie to a police officer at the scene. She was far too intelligent for that. She asked for something that sounded procedural and boring, and was, in fact, the foundation stone of everything that followed. She asked him to sign the internal incident report, the one with a small box near the top of page 2, listing the operator of the vehicle at the time of collision. Elliot read it. He read every line twice, the way he had read 10,000 documents in a former life, and Reese Whitlock shifted his weight impatiently, because nobody expects a safety specialist to actually read. The form was clean and neutral, and it would flow into the insurer's file, the fleet database, and the acquisition disclosure schedule, and every downstream document would inherit its assumption without ever questioning it. That is how corporate truth is manufactured. Not with a lie shouted at an officer, but with one checked box on page 2 that 400 later pages politely agree with. Elliot looked up and asked what happened if he did not sign. Human Resources will explain the rest to you in the morning. His phone buzzed in his jacket. It was a message from Maya, 11 words long, asking whether he was coming home for dinner because she had made the rice wrong again and needed backup. He looked at that message while a fine rain started, the kind that does not fall so much as hang. Then he thought about the mortgage and the counselor's invoices that were still arriving, and the fact that a 39-year-old man with a 3-year gap in his specialty does not get to be principled for free. He took the pen. He signed his name in the operator field of a report stating that Elliot Hayes had been driving. Sloan exhaled, looked almost human for one moment, then turned away to call her chief financial officer. She thought she had won. What she did not see, because she had already stopped looking at him, was the small thing he did next. Before handing the tablet back, Elliot photographed every page with his outdated phone, all 6 of them, including the header with the automatically generated timestamp and reference number. Then, sitting on a bus bench 2 blocks away with his shoulder throbbing, he opened his personal email and sent himself a message with the photographs attached and 1 line of text, signed under threat of termination. I was not driving. Sloan Harrington operated the vehicle. Attention monitoring disabled at 4:06 by driver. The message left his outbox at 5:19, and a server in a data center he would never see stamped that moment permanently into the record. At 11 that morning, an executive session convened about the acquisition, and Elliot was summoned upstairs to be available for questions about the safety file. He was not invited into the room. He was asked to wait in the chairs outside the glass wall, like a delivery, and through that glass he watched his own signed report appear on the wall display, blown up 7 feet wide, the operator field legible from where he sat. A director he had met twice asked whether the transaction should be delayed given the optics of a crash involving a company vehicle. Sloan's answer came through the door seam, clear as a bell struck in an empty church. No, we're discussing an error by a fleet safety employee. This is not a leadership issue. She did not stop at one lie. By Thursday, the internal narrative had grown limbs. His system access was suspended pending review, a phrase that means nothing and destroys everything. His badge stopped opening the Telematics portal. A meeting invitation vanished from his calendar without explanation. A colleague named Dana, who had brought him coffee every Tuesday for 2 years, suddenly discovered a fascinating email whenever he approached. Corporations do not fire people all at once anymore. They lower the temperature 2 degrees a day until the person leaves and calls it a decision. On Friday morning, a formal notice arrived from Human Resources. He was under investigation for operating a company vehicle without due care, for violating fleet policy regarding attention monitoring compliance, and for causing damage to company property in excess of $80,000. The document referenced his signed report 4 separate times, and each reference made the next one sound more established, the way a rumor becomes history by repetition. Not one of Sloan's promises appeared anywhere. No coverage of expenses, no internal handling, no raise. Instead, a paragraph noting that findings could result in termination for cause, which would strip his severance, his leave payout, and his ability to explain a gap on a resume. They called him upstairs on Monday. Sloan sat behind a desk the size of a dining table in an office with a view of 3 bridges, and she did not stand when he entered. There was no apology, no thank you, no acknowledgement whatsoever of the rain or the intersection or the sentence about single fathers. There was a folder, squared precisely to the edge of the desk, and she slid it across with 2 fingers. A separation agreement. 3 months of salary in a lump sum, in exchange for a mutual release, a confidentiality provision, and a covenant not to make any statement inconsistent with the internal incident report. He read that last clause 3 times because it was the most honest sentence in the entire document. It did not say "do not lie," it said "do not stop lying." Sloan watched him read and misread his silence entirely. She thought he was converting the number into months of rent, and she leaned back slightly with the ease of someone who has watched 100 people convert principles into currency. "For your position," she said, "that's a very generous offer." "My position," Elliot repeated. It was not a question and not quite an echo. "Elliot, don't turn this into something it isn't." Her tone was almost gentle now, which was somehow worse, the patience of an adult explaining weather to a child. "You're a mid-level safety employee. The company will continue whether you're here or not. In 6 months, nobody in this building will remember it happened, including you." She meant it kindly, in the way certain people mean the cruelest things kindly, and it was the purest expression of her worldview, that a person's life could be measured against a company's continuity and found to be the smaller number. Elliot pushed the folder back across the desk. It slid the full width and stopped exactly where she had started it. "Then you should continue without me," he said, and stood up. His shoulder still hurt when he did that, and he let it show, because there was no longer any reason to perform comfort for her. Sloane's expression flickered once, the way a screen flickers before it changes what it is displaying. She had prepared for negotiation. She had not prepared for refusal. At the door, she said the thing people from families like hers always eventually say: "Don't try to fight a Harrington." She said it without heat, as practical advice, as though warning him about a road closure. Elliot stopped with his hand on the frame. "I'm not going to fight the name," he said. He turned his head just enough that she could see one side of his face. "I'm going to tell the truth about you." Then he walked out, and the door closed with the expensive whisper of a door that has never once been slammed. Here is where most stories of this kind go wrong, and here is where this one did not. Elliot Hayes did not go home and record a furious video. He did not call a journalist, did not draft a 1,000-word denunciation, did not send Sloan a screenshot of anything, which would have accomplished nothing except telling her exactly what to destroy. He sat at his kitchen table after Maya went to bed and wrote a list, and the list was not a manifesto. It was a chain of custody. Because the man everyone thought was a slightly rigid paperwork technician had spent nearly 10 years doing one thing better than almost anyone in the region, proving, from physical evidence, who had actually been behind the wheel. He called Marcus Bell at 8 in the morning. Marcus was 44, ran a 4-person practice out of a converted brick warehouse, and had spent 6 years on the opposite side of Elliot's testimony before deciding he preferred plaintiffs. When he heard the voice on the line, he laughed out loud. "I thought you got out of reconstruction entirely." "So did I," Elliot answered. They met at 10. Marcus made him tell the whole story twice, once straight through and once backward, interrupting constantly, stripping out every adjective, because the fastest way to lose a case like this is to arrive with a grievance instead of a record. Then they built the list together, and it was beautiful in the way only a well-constructed evidentiary chain is beautiful. The municipal traffic camera at 9th and Callahan, which the city retained for a limited window before overriding. The event data recorder in the sedan, which captures speed, braking, steering, belt status, and occupancy in the final seconds before deployment. The seat position memory, because that car stored driver profiles and adjusted automatically, and Sloan was 5'6" while Elliot was 6'1". The attention monitoring logs with every alert and every manual override tied to a user account. The corporate phone records, an exterior camera above a hardware store on the northeast corner. The paramedics narrative, documenting which occupant emerged from which door, and the email Elliot had sent himself at 5:19. Marcus underlined one thing on the legal pad and turned it around. You do not touch a single one of these yourself. You don't log in. You don't ask a friend in fleet operations. You don't download anything you had access to yesterday." Elliot nodded, because he had reached the same conclusion at 2 in the morning. The instant he took anything improperly, the story would stop being about a chief executive who falsified a report and become a story about a disgruntled employee who stole data. The evidence had to arrive clean, or it would arrive worthless. So they did the slow, boring, devastating thing instead. Marcus sent a litigation hold letter that afternoon to the general counsel, the registered agent, the insurance carrier, and the third-party telematics vendor that hosted the fleet data on its own servers. It identified, by vehicle identification number and by date, exactly which data streams were to be preserved, and it cited the obligations regarding destruction of evidence with a specificity no ordinary employment lawyer would have possessed. He simultaneously filed a public records request for the intersection footage. Nothing about it was dramatic. It was 4 pages of dry language that quietly turned every hard drive in the building into a loaded weapon pointed at whoever tried to erase it. The letter reached the 16th floor on a Wednesday afternoon, and within an hour the vendor had confirmed preservation in writing, which meant the data now lived somewhere Harrington Mobility could not reach. And someone in that room finally asked the question nobody had thought to ask in 3 years of performance reviews. Reese Whitlock set the letter in front of Sloan and said, "What did Hayes do before he came here?" "Fleet safety," she said, without looking up. He placed a second folder on the desk, 4 pages printed from a professional licensing database, and a public court records search. Elliot Hayes, credentialed accident reconstruction analyst, 9 years and 4 months of practice, 211 retained engagements, 43 depositions, 11 trial testimonies, including 2 in federal court. A published methodology note on determining seat occupancy from restraint system telemetry that had been cited in a state appellate decision. Sloan read it in complete silence, and I want you to understand what she was actually reading. It was not a resume. It was a list of the precise techniques that would be used to prove she had been driving. She tried money first because money had always worked. 2 days later, Harrington's outside counsel contacted Marcus with a revised proposal, and the number had grown from 3 months of salary to something closer to 4 years of it, enough to erase the mortgage entirely, enough to fund a college account. In exchange, Elliot would affirm the incident report as accurate, withdraw all requests for vehicle data, release all claims, and sign a perpetual confidentiality agreement with a damages clause attached. Marcus relayed it in a flat voice and then waited, because good lawyers never tell a client what a number should mean to him. Elliot considered it for about 4 minutes, most of which he spent looking at a photograph of Diane on the bookshelf. Then he declined. Sloan called him directly that evening, which her lawyers had explicitly advised against, and her voice had lost some of its lacquer. "Do you think you're becoming some kind of hero?" she asked. "No," Elliot said. "I just don't want to be the man who lied for you." There was a pause long enough that he could hear an ice cube shift in a glass. She hung up, and that was the last time she attempted to buy him. The city footage arrived 11 days later on a scratched optical disc. The angle was imperfect, mounted high on a signal mast, and the resolution was the merciful blur of municipal budgets. But it was enough. In the 4 seconds before impact, through the windshield of the approaching sedan, 2 occupants were visible. A smaller figure with light hair on the left, a larger figure with dark hair on the right. 18 seconds after impact, the passenger door opened, and a tall man in a dark jacket stepped out of the right side and moved directly toward the SUV. 9 seconds after that, the driver's door opened and a woman got out and stood beside the fender adjusting her coat. There was no mechanical failure, no defect, and no ambiguity of any kind. But the data was not what ruined her. Because in the preserved email archive, timestamped 6:52 on the evening of the collision, 1 hour and 33 minutes after Elliot signed, there was a message from Sloan Harrington to Reese Whitlock and one other internal recipient. It was 4 sentences long. The relevant one read, "Keep Hayes attached to the incident. We cannot have my name connected to this before the vote." Marcus read it aloud in his office and then set the page down very carefully, the way you set down something heavier than it looks. Up to that sentence, this was a collision with a coerced statement. After it, it was a documented, deliberate decision by a chief executive to move responsibility for her own conduct onto a subordinate in order to protect a transaction. While her lawyers were still building a containment strategy around a lawsuit they assumed would settle, the piece she had entirely forgotten about called Marcus Bell's office line. Graham Caldwell had spent 3 weeks in a sling, had received exactly 1 communication from Harrington Mobility in that time, an adjuster's form letter, and had not received a single phone call from the woman who hit him. He wanted to provide a statement. He also wanted to see Elliot Hayes again, because he had been trying to place the face for a month, and had finally managed it at 2 in the morning, unable to sleep on his bad shoulder. They met in the warehouse office on a Thursday. Graham stood when Elliot came in, offered his left hand because the right one still did not cooperate, and smiled with real delight. "It took me a while to place you. You had a beard in the Ashland freight case. 2014. You cost my opposing counsel about $9 million, and you were the most irritating expert I have ever had the pleasure of watching." Elliot laughed for the first time in weeks, a short, surprised sound. Graham had practiced corporate liability law for 31 years before retiring, and he remembered Elliot for a very specific reason. "There was a moment in that case," Graham said, "where the party that retained you badly wanted a different conclusion, and there was a great deal of money available for a different conclusion. You sat in a room full of people who outranked you and told them the physical evidence said what it said, and if they wanted a different answer, they would have to hire a different man." He shifted the sling. "I told my partners afterward that you were the hardest man in the room to buy." There it was, laid beside Sloan's assessment. 2 people had looked at the same man, and only one of them had been paying attention. There was one more thing, mentioned almost as an afterthought, the way people who have spent their lives in leverage tend to mention leverage. In retirement, Graham had taken advisory work, and for 4 years he had consulted for an institutional fund holding a meaningful minority position in Harrington Mobility. He was careful about what that did and did not mean. He could not remove a chief executive. He had no board seat, no proxy, no ability to force any outcome. What he could do was write to the chairman, on behalf of an investor, describing documented executive misconduct and requesting that the board convene a special session and open an independent inquiry before voting on a $400 million acquisition. The letter reached Nathaniel Prescott on a Tuesday. Prescott was 55, chairman of the board, a cold and precise man who had never pretended to be anyone's friend. He was not a hero and had no intention of becoming one, but he had spent a career watching corporations survive scandals and die from cover-ups, and he understood with absolute clarity that a distracted driving accident costs a company a headline, while a fabricated internal record costs it its disclosure integrity, its carrier relationship, its lending covenants, and possibly its board. He read the letter twice, called the general counsel, and asked one question: does an internal incident report exist with an operator name on it? When the answer came back yes, he postponed the vote within the hour. Sloan called Elliot that night. It was the first time in the entire ordeal that her voice broke its polish completely, and I confess I felt something almost like pity, listening to a person discover in real time that the floor she had stood on her whole life was other people's deference. "Do you have any idea what you're doing to this company?" "The same thing you did to me," Elliot answered. I was trying to protect thousands of people. No, he said, and there was no cruelty in it, which made it worse. You were protecting your chair. She did not answer, because for the first time in her adult life, someone had described her accurately, and there was no assistant in the room to end the call. The special session convened on a Thursday morning in a boardroom with a table cut from a single slab of walnut. Sloan arrived in charcoal, composed 10 minutes early, and she still believed she would win. That belief was not irrational. The family trust held a substantial block. 3 directors had been appointed during her tenure, and she had never once left a room like this having lost. Elliot arrived at 9:40 with Marcus Bell, wearing a plain Oxford shirt, carrying nothing but a folder, and when he sat down in the witness chair, Sloan looked at him with frank incomprehension, as though a piece of office furniture had been given a seat. She paused as she passed him and said, very quietly, without moving her lips much, "Do you really think they'll choose you over me?" Elliot did not look up. "They don't have to choose me," he said, squaring the folder against the edge of the table. "They just have to look at the evidence." She took her seat. Nathaniel Prescott called the session to order, and the machinery she had spent her life assuming belonged to her began, item by item, to belong to the facts instead. She opened strongly, because she was extremely good at this. She characterized the matter as an unfortunate collision followed by an internal reporting dispute, expressed sympathy for Mr. Caldwell, noted that the vehicle had been operated by a member of the Fleet Safety Department, and displayed the signed report on the wall screen with Elliot's signature enlarged beneath the operator field. For about 90 seconds it worked. Then Marcus asked the chair's permission to introduce a single document, and Sloan made her final mistake, which was to permit it out of the certainty that nothing a small firm attorney produced could possibly matter. The screen changed to an email header. Sender, Elliot Hayes. Recipient, Elliot Hayes. Timestamp, 5:19 in the evening on the day of the collision, 41 minutes after his signature, and more than an hour before Sloan's own message. The body read, signed under threat of termination. I was not driving. Sloan Harrington operated the vehicle. Attention monitoring disabled at 4:06 by driver. Attached, 6 photographs of the report taken at the scene with the original reference number visible. A director in a gray suit put down his pen. Nobody spoke for 4 full seconds, and in a boardroom 4 seconds is a geological era. Marcus moved to the second exhibit in silence, because he had learned from Elliot that evidence argues better when nobody decorates it. The intersection footage played in silence, 22 seconds of it, twice. 2 occupants through the windshield, the passenger door opening first, the tall man walking to the SUV, then the driver's door, and Sloan Harrington stepping out and adjusting her coat while a 67-year-old man sat injured 40 feet away. When it ended, nobody asked to see it again. There was nothing left in it to interpret. The third exhibit was the preserved telematics package, presented by an independent analyst Marcus had retained precisely so Elliot would never have to testify about his own case. Seat track index 14, seat back at 19 degrees, matching the stored profile keyed to the chief executive's employee number, a configuration that would have left a 6'1" man with his knees against the steering column. Driver's belt latched at 3:51 and never released until after deployment. Passenger belt released first 40 seconds after impact. 7 attention alerts in 11 minutes. 1 manual override of the safety package at 4:06 and 11 seconds from the driver's touchscreen under her user account. The analyst spoke for 6 minutes in a bored monotone, and it was the most efficient demolition I have ever witnessed. The fourth exhibit was 1 sentence in 1 email. Keep Hayes attached to the incident. We cannot have my name connected to this before the vote. Nathaniel Prescott read it aloud, which he did not have to do, and then turned in his chair and looked down the length of the walnut table at the woman whose great-grandfather's portrait hung in the lobby 8 floors below. Miss Harrington, when you wrote that sentence, were you protecting this company or protecting yourself? She began to answer. She had a version prepared, something about deal risk and fiduciary judgment. But the sentence stood on the wall, behind her, in white letters 2 feet tall, and she stopped halfway through, because even she could hear that the words did not fit the evidence. Then the door opened and Graham Caldwell walked in with his arm still in a sling. I watched her register him, and I watched the exact moment she understood who he was, and it was the only moment in the entire proceeding when she looked genuinely afraid. She had never learned his name. She had asked her legal department to handle him and moved on, and she had built her whole defense on the unexamined assumption that the man in the other vehicle was a piece of paperwork. He sat down without being asked, declined water, and told the board in 4 minutes what he had seen and heard, in the flat, unhurried cadence of a man who had spent 31 years being deposed by people far more skilled than anyone present. He said the driver's door opened after the passenger door. He said the tall man came to him first and asked his name and the date. He said that no one from Harrington Mobility had contacted him personally in the 23 days since, and he said it without bitterness, which somehow made it land harder. And he said he had heard a woman's voice on the far side of the wrecked sedan ask whether anyone had seen who was driving, before she had asked anyone whether he was alive. Nobody shouted. No officers burst through the door. There was only a long table of people who had spent their careers being careful around the name Harrington, looking at Sloan Harrington in complete silence. Prescott called the vote before lunch. The board suspended her immediately, appointed an interim chief executive from the operations side, retained an independent firm to conduct a full inquiry, and instructed the general counsel to notify the carrier and the lenders. It took 11 minutes and was conducted with the same procedural blandness as a vote on a parking lot lease, which is the true nature of institutional power and always has been. Sloan stood. She looked across the room at the man she had described as a mid-level employee the company would continue without, and he had not raised his voice one single time in 4 weeks. He was not smiling. That was somehow the part she could not bear. Harrington Mobility, through Nathaniel Prescott, made him an extraordinary offer. Immediate reinstatement with full back pay, compensation for the suspension period, a substantial raise, and a promotion to Director of Fleet Safety reporting to the Executive Committee, with authority over exactly the policy he had proposed that Tuesday morning. Prescott delivered it himself and said, with the closest thing to warmth he possessed, "You've demonstrated this company needs someone like you." Elliot considered it seriously for about a day, because he was not a man who enjoyed dramatic gestures, and the salary was genuinely significant. Then he declined. "The company already had someone like me," he told Prescott, "for 3 years, filing reports nobody read in a department on the restructuring list. The problem was never that you didn't have the person. It was that nobody was willing to listen until it cost you $400 million. Prescott did not argue, which Elliot respected. Instead, they negotiated the 2 things he actually wanted: a reasonable settlement acknowledging the coercion without requiring silence about it, and a formal written correction placed in his personnel file, the insurer's file, and the state motor vehicle record, stating that Elliot Hayes had not been operating the vehicle and that all allegations against him were withdrawn as unfounded. Graham Caldwell called 2 weeks later with a proposition that was neither charity nor favor, which is why Elliot accepted it. In 31 years of practice, Graham had accumulated a network of carriers, defense firms, and plaintiff shops perpetually short of independent reconstruction analysts who could withstand cross-examination and could not be bought. He made 9 phone calls, 6 produced meetings, and 4 produced retainer agreements before the quarter ended. Elliot did not become wealthy and did not become famous. He simply reopened, in a rented second-floor office above a bicycle repair shop, the small consulting practice he had closed 3 years earlier, when grief convinced him that being a good father required becoming a smaller man. The independent inquiry took 4 months, and its conclusions were not close. Sloan Harrington was formally removed by the board, and not, in the end, primarily for the collision. Distracted driving is a citation and a premium increase and a bad afternoon. She was removed for coercing a subordinate into accepting responsibility for her conduct, for causing a materially false internal record to be created and circulated into disclosure documents, for attempting to conceal her involvement from the board during an active transaction, and for placing her personal position above the governance of the company she was entrusted to lead. The acquisition eventually closed 7 months late, at a reduced price, under someone else. She did not lose everything, and I refuse to pretend otherwise, because the fantasy of total ruin is a lie that lets everyone off the hook. The family trust was untouched. She kept her house, her investments, and a name that still opened certain doors in certain cities. But she lost the one thing that had ever actually defined her, and she lost it completely. There was no assistant. There was no car waiting at the curb. There was no room that stood when she entered it. There was no longer any circumstance in which a single sentence from her could alter the permanent record of another human being's life. And over a very long summer she discovered she had never really known who she was without that. 9 weeks after the removal she asked to meet him. He declined. She sent one more message, 4 words long, "It isn't about money." He thought about that for 2 days and then agreed, and they met at a coffee shop with mismatched chairs on a street neither of them had any reason to be on. She arrived without makeup, without a driver, without anyone, wearing a sweater and holding her own cup, and she looked 10 years older and considerably more real. They sat for almost a minute without speaking, which was the first honest thing that had ever passed between them. "I thought you signed because you were weak," she said finally. "I signed," Elliot answered, "because you put a father in a position where he had to choose between the truth and his ability to feed his family. You knew that when you said it. You chose that sentence on purpose." Sloan looked down at the table. "That's worse," she said quietly, and it was the first time she had agreed with him about anything. He did not tell her it was all right. He did not forgive her. Because forgiveness that arrives on schedule is only politeness wearing a costume. And she had not earned it, and he was not obligated to manufacture it. What he said instead was the thing she carried out of that coffee shop and, I suspect, will carry for the rest of her life. "What you did wrong didn't start at that intersection." She looked up. "It started a long time before, when you decided a person's whole life was worth less than your chair. The crash didn't make you into someone who would do that. It just finally created a situation where you had to." He put money on the table for both cups, which she noticed and never mentioned, and he left first. She sat there another 20 minutes. A year later, Hayes Accident Analysis occupied 2 rooms above the bicycle shop and employed exactly 1.5 people. There was no lobby portrait and no walnut table. The chairs were mismatched. The coffee was bad, and the work was extraordinarily good. He testified in 4 cases that year, twice for carriers and twice against them, which was precisely the reputation he wanted. On a Thursday in October, he closed his laptop at 4:15 in the afternoon, in the middle of a report that could wait until Friday, because it could wait until Friday, and because he had finally started believing that. Maya was 13 and taller and merciless. She looked up from her homework when he came through the door before 5, and observed that it was nice to see her father finally learning how to stop working on time, at his age, with medical supervision. Elliot laughed and told her the rice was still her responsibility. On the counter under a grocery receipt was a plain envelope with no return address and no logo, addressed in careful handwriting. He opened it standing up, read it twice, and then sat down. It was a short letter from Sloan Harrington. She did not ask for a job or a retraction or a character reference or forgiveness, and she did not explain herself. She wrote that she had spent 6 months serving as an unpaid advisor to an organization supporting the families of people injured by distracted drivers, that she had not told them her full history until the 2nd month, and that they had let her stay. The last line read, "That day I thought you destroyed my life, and now I understand I had been doing that myself for years before the cars ever touched." Elliot folded the letter, put it back in the envelope, and set it in a drawer. He did not call her. Not out of spite, and not out of any lingering wish to see her suffer, but because there was nothing yet that needed saying, and because some conversations are only worth having after the years have done their work. He went and burned the rice with his daughter instead. Outside, the streetlights came on at their appointed hour, indifferent to everyone. And I thought about how Sloan Harrington had stood in the rain that afternoon, absolutely certain she could select which human being would bear the consequences of her own attention, and how she had, by pure chance and her own contempt, selected the one man in the entire building who knew precisely how to prove who had been holding the wheel. That is the whole of it. She did not lose because he was secretly rich or secretly powerful. She lost because she believed a man without leverage was a man without recourse, and because she never once considered that competence might be sitting quietly at a desk on the 14th floor. The collision did not end either of their lives. It ended 2 versions of 2 people. A man who believed being a good father required him to be smaller than he was, and a woman who believed her name was the same thing as the truth. That day changed both their lives, and only one of them chose it.